Well, good afternoon. I'm pleased and sorry to say that this is our last panel of the day. We have all been hard at work here today, and so I appreciate your attention, your continued enthusiasm. And we're finishing off with a very fascinating panel focused on civil society and working with NGOs. I think you know all our speakers, so I will save time for our discussion, but I wanted to open the floor to our minister for his opening remarks, and then from there we'll go to questions and answers. Mr. Minister.
The last panel is dealing with the several elements, civil society, NGOs, and the peace, in relation to the peace. For civil society, it has been written that it is the arena where people associate to advance common interest. It is an old notion from the antique time. In the Roman, it was societas civilis, introduced by Cicero, and during the medieval time, they lost, the notion has been lost. They have discussed problems like the just war and so on. The actual meaning of the concept of civil society has changed first after the French Revolution, and second after the fall of communism. Next to it is are the NGOs, non-governmental organizations. The term originated from the UN and is normally used to refer to organizations that are not a part of the government. It is voluntary, non-state, non-profit, non-religious, and non-military association. It is astonishing how many NGOs are there in the world. In India, in the year 2009, there have been 3.3 million of different NGOs. In Russia, more than 200,000 NGOs. In USA, 40,000. Now the question might be, how happened? How is with the funding? It's one of our topic here. Funding is, be it for the small or large, it's various, it depends. Some of the NGOs are supported by the governments, like Nobel Prize winner Doctors Without Borders get 46% of its income from the government sources. Several EU grants provide funds accessible to NGOs. If we bring NGOs to the peace problem, to keep peace as it is on the title, I selected some of those who have been dealing with the peace, like, just to mention one, the World Federation for UN Associations. Under auspices of the UN, they have promotion of international peace and security. They are contributing to the removal of obstacles to peace. They work for justice, security, and disarmament, and to promote the development of peaceful coexistence and cooperation. They have two projects. One, it has been discussed several times here, responsibility to protect. Dr. Adams knows everything about it. And the second project is the Zero World Disarmament Program. When we have been discussing the problem of the arms, guns, and other things, probably one of the next topics for the ICD will be the problem of disarmament and proliferation of nuclear weapons and so on, in order to save it from the possible terrorist attack and so on. This problem is there, it's present. Think about Iran. or Israel, who is saying that they need immediate preventive attack on Iran, it's rather dangerous to speak about nuclear weapons being used as for ensign. So cultural diplomacy must be interested in soft power types of activities, so rejecting possible most brutal, catastrophic power used by the nuclear weapons that are still one possibility. I would like to mention that I have been one of the founders and one of the previous president of the society which has special category consultative status with the ECOSOC. ECOSOC is one of the UN NGO status. If you can reach it, it's important. Society I have been dealing with is, and it's called the World Society of Victimology. It has been several times mentioned, victims, different kind of victims. There has been dignity of victims mentioned by Dr. Storm, dignity that lasts even after the death. This is why it is important to bring those people from the graves to the proper place, to place them in peace if it is possible, as it has been seen on Srebrenica case and some other cases. So another important aspect of the NGO's activities are those oriented toward the peace. Peace, which is a state of harmony characterized by the lack of violent conflict and the freedom from fear of violence and so on. There are peace movements, there are peacekeeping missions. There is a bizarre, somehow, unusual, but very interesting organization, NGOs, called Peace One Day. Peace One Day, a non-profit organization with the objective to raise awareness of the International Day of Peace, which occurs on 21st September each year. The objective of the organization is foster Peace Day as a day for wide-scale community action and a day for UN agencies and aid organizations to safely carry out life-saving work and so on. Proposal for this have been done by one Jeremy Gillis in 1998. He conceived the idea of a single day when all countries vowed not to wage war, a worldwide ceasefire, and the day for or of nonviolence. Unlike Immanuel Kant, who was looking for eternal peace, ewiges Frieden, which was a good idea, but naive one. It was his experience within the first experience with the Napoleon's wars. Similar destiny happened to Beethoven. So eternal peace, allied to the eternal peace, there is one day peace, but let's accept it as one of the positive action of one of the many of millions of NGOs, since they are related directly to the peace. There is one UN Peace Building Commission, which is established by UN General Assembly and Security Council in 2005 with the mandate, you can imagine, Peace Building Commission. I believe that the cultural diplomacy is one of those respective organizations. According to Mark Donfried founder and director of the ICD. Cultural diplomacy is based on 5 principles, and it's good to repeat it, and I shall close with this. It is respect for and recognition of cultural diversity and heritage. Second, global intercultural dialogue. Third, justice, equality, and interdependence. Fourth, protection of international human rights. And then global peace and stability. Global peace and stability was one of the aims of goals of this summit. I believe we have added something very important to this very noble goal of this group and the organizer of this summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that was an excellent way of opening this discussion. I know that we've spent much of our days with this panel talking, and I'd love to engage more, as Mark did in the previous panel, with you all. I know that there's also a number of students here from different faculties studying politics and foreign relations, and I know from my experience as a professor, we tend to call the students to answer questions. I want to invite the students of the room in particular to ask us questions. So, will any of the students like to have some questions before I call on you? Somebody raise their hand. There we go.
Involving China. There's in China they have one child per couple policy, and where no brothers or sisters are allowed. And I wonder if you consider this like an assault on women and children, because forced abortions are being made even in late stages of pregnancy. And if this also can be considered like sort of a genocidal act against one set of human beings. Thank you.
The quick answer is no. I don't consider that a form of genocide. I think we have to be very clear about, again, as I said in the last session, about what the crimes are and how they're codified. Does that constitute an imposition upon the human rights of ordinary Chinese in terms of women's right to control their reproductive capacity? Yes, it is. Is that something that the Chinese state and the Chinese people need to look at? Absolutely, but I don't believe it constitutes an act of genocide.
If I might be able to add something on that too, I'd like to make 2 points. First of all, I'd like to say something about civil society, which can mean very different things in different contexts, namely China and the USA, where civil society can mean very different things. Secondly, I'd like to respond by talking about briefly the connection between cultural diplomacy and human rights. First of all, very briefly for civil society, I think in essence for me the purest form of civil society is actually what happened more or less in the United States, where the American government traditionally does relatively little for its citizens in comparison to the German government or some other governments. And I think it was because of those deficits where basically citizens would come together and say, hey, let's help other citizens. So really in its purest form, that's really the origins, I would say, of civil society, citizens coming together with the effort to help other citizens. Independent from the government, but can also work with the government. And there are many examples in the US where one does have very good partnerships between public sector and civil society. Second example would be Turkey, up until very recently, where for a long time it was very difficult to actually start NGOs and to actually have civil society. There was almost a distrust on behalf of the government in the sense, hey, citizens coming together, grouping, that could be dangerous. And you actually had to go to a police station and register, and it was quite difficult. We did a conference in Istanbul about 3 years ago. At that point, I think it was 7 or 9% of Turkish population participated in civil society. It's on the rise, especially with the European process. Japan would be a third, very different example. In Japan, you had no civil society until the 70s. And you also had no cultural diplomacy until the 70s, where the Japanese government actually said, hey, this is something that we should have. And really a top-down approach. The Japanese government started in 1972, the Japan Foundation, and set up a number of NGOs and civil society organizations with a top-down approach. So I just mentioned that, just so that we realize civil society can mean very different things in different contexts. To your point about China, I think you raise a very interesting example of actually where I think culture diplomacy can help. In the past, culture diplomacy, to generalize, was more or less governmental, more or less with the goal, how do we win the hearts and minds of foreign audiences? Let's tell America's story to the world. Let's make others like us. You wouldn't talk about human rights. You wouldn't talk about difficult things. You'd just talk about the nice things. You'd send jazz musicians. And even though I have nothing against that, I think really at the Institute for Culture Diplomacy, as we define culture diplomacy and look to the future, we always say culture diplomacy is firstly, how do we educate, how do we enhance, and how do we sustain relationships? Secondly, it's about building dialogue, understanding, and trust. And if we want to build trust between China and Slovenia, China and the USA, or any of the countries we mentioned today, trust means we need to talk about the good things and the bad things. We need to talk about our strengths, and we need to talk about our weaknesses. Reconciliation has a very high potential. So as we talk about China and a variety of violations we can mention that are happening there, I think that is part, or that should be part of culture diplomacy. We should try to create forums in which one can, in a respectful way and also in a humble way, discuss these also difficult topics. And I think through that dialogue, progress can be made. By ignoring those issues and just talking about the positive things, I don't think we're going to make progress there. Because for us, the future of culture diplomacy is really building trust. As I think Professor Separovic pointed out earlier today, there is really no truth. Or actually, I think it was Judge Schoenberg. There is no truth in the sense if we're looking for what is the absolute truth, I think we have to give up. We have to be humble enough to realize there are many different interpretations of the truth. There are many different interpretations of history. And our task as cultural diplomats or historians is to try to collect all of those and try the best we can to make sense of the picture, realizing we will never have a fully illuminated room. So in that sense, I think the challenge you mentioned when it came to China is maybe also a task we could give to the cultural diplomats, how one can, through cultural diplomacy, embrace these difficult topics and to try to allow for further exchange with the ultimate goal that one can actually improve the situation and also ultimately, hopefully, save lives. So just as a brief response in terms of civil society and what perhaps the future of cultural diplomacy could do.
I support this idea of cultural dialogue. And going back to the question from China, it is not acceptable from the standpoint of human rights to do such a thing, to have such a decision, such a policy in having or not having baby and what sex is it, and so on. So I agree that it is by no means a question of genocide. It is influential for the newcomers, for the new babies, for the new generations, and very strong and strange decision. But this is because they are overpopulated, they believe that they should have such a policy. Unlike this, in Europe, we have opposite tendencies. And then, as an advantage to change the negative situation in demographical aspect in Europe, Chinese are coming to Europe more and more frequently. 1 million of Turks are in Berlin. I don't know how many Chinese are now in Germany and in Europe, but I know that the biggest number of the newcomers to my country, small country, are Chinese.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, right there. And then in the green.
Thank you very much. This question has a little bit more to do with the previous panel discussion. However, I would like to post it. My name is Virginia Palm. I come from the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. I would like to ask the panel about your thoughts about, we recently heard that the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the European Union. As the Judge Schoenberg earlier this morning pointed out, that we should ask what can be done on a national domestic level, then at a regional level, and finally what could be done on a global level. What, in your opinion, is the role of the European Union? What can be done? Why is there not more done? Or what is your response to this about also taking responsibility as one agent in whole? Thank you.
Yes, you.
One European, we'll start with you.
So go ahead.
I was referring to you.
I'm only a partial European. I have a European passport through my parents, but I grew up on the other side of the world and on another continent. So, but I think the EU has played a positive role at the United Nations around these issues, and certainly we interact with the with the EU delegation quite closely in New York, and they actually have played a fairly positive role in terms of trying to cohere debate amongst missions in New York around responsibility to protect issues. And so where does that become important? It becomes important at times, for example, like the opening of the General Assembly or of the interactive debate on R2P that takes place each year, where the EU will actually get together and hold meetings with the EU group and think about the key issues that they want to raise as the EU within the forum and so forth. They're not bound by it, but they certainly discuss it, and we've generally found that to be a very useful process. At the moment, we're talking to the EU about the possibility of them appointing a focal point as an EU focal point, but also pushing it amongst the EU group itself. We already have, I'd have to look at my list, but there's already something like 7, 8, 9 maybe states in the EU that have already appointed R2P focal points, but obviously we want them all to. But that's all I would say about the EU.
Other questions? Sir, did you have one? Okay, right there, sir.
Hello, Rand. I would like only to add a comment. We have also included among NGOs those civil society which is offspring of NATO, namely Atlantic Treaty Association, has in each country a club which is actually pursuing the ideas of democracy, human rights, etc., and spreading these ideas into the neighborhood. Another organization is Pan-Europic Movement, which is also a civil society based on the European Union. Both are active also in Slovenia, and they have done a lot of efforts to spread the democratic values and then peace and the knowledge about how to achieve peace and other aspects of human rights in the Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe. It's worthwhile to mention their efforts and their work among the young generation. There are clubs of Young Atlantic Treaty Association which are very, very active in this field.
Thank you very much. And having participated as a young leader going to the Lisbon Summit, I can applaud all your efforts in trying to include so many people to have an experience of seeing the NATO summits and how they actually work. So thank you very much, Father Lepa. Other questions? Yes, Professor.
I have one comment and one question. And comment is to the role of the European Union. Actually, I believe that there is a big potential in the role of the European Parliament. European Parliament probably being one of the biggest international institutions, being directly elected, and also have a very good outreach to civil society. And the European Parliament has already taken an interest in R2P, has already organized a couple of sessions on R2P. I happened to participate in 2 of these events, and I think they were very successful, and I think Slovenia should also in the future support such events, even maybe more actively than in the past, and I think this is also one contribution that Slovenia can give to the promotion of R2P. And the question is more relating to the topic of today's session, let's say Syrian crisis. And I wonder, and this is my question to everyone actually, anyone can comment on it, why in the case of Syria, where Security Council is paralyzed, obviously because of the veto of Russia and China as well, why the states haven't resorted to the Uniting for Peace resolution, and why didn't they call for emergency special session on the situation in Syria? So do you see what could be the reasons for not resorting to this option where it was used in the past, and as we know it is used whenever the Security Council is blocked and the action is needed in order to prevent mass atrocities from happening. Thank you. And just a comment, obviously in General Assembly there are enough votes because the resolutions that were adopted in the General Assembly were adopted with more than 131 votes necessary for the two-thirds majority that is necessary for convening such a session. Thank you.
So Mark already gazing at me when
To our local New Yorker.
procedural motions in the UN. They're thinking, who wants to handle these nitty-gritty questions on UN business? I think as the situation in Syria has become more intractable and people have become more frustrated with the blockage in the Security Council, people have started looking for solutions to either unblock that within the UN system or to go around it and go outside it. My own view, my personal view has been that too much that debate has been presented as the choice is doing nothing or military intervention. I don't think that's the case. I think actually military intervention, there's a balance of consequences argument, and could actually make the situation considerably worse, especially with the situation that we currently have. But I don't think the choice is between doing nothing and F-18s or cruise missiles either. I think there is a lot more that the international community can do. On the second part of that, there is a growing number of people who are saying, well, why can't the world, those who want to see some kind of military intervention, saying, why can't the world just ignore the Security Council and just do it? And of course, we have some precedent for this, not least of all, and most recently, I guess, with regard to Kosovo. My own view and the view of our center on Kosovo is that it was morally justifiable but illegal under international law. And you either have a rules-based international order or you don't have a rules-based international order. I happen to believe in a rules-based international order. But the reality also is that there are plenty of ways in which if countries really wanted to militarily intervene in Syria at the moment, they could. So, for example, the cross-border fire into Turkey could easily cause Turkey to invoke protection under the NATO Charter. It doesn't want to, and nobody wants Turkey to do that because they actually don't want to get into a military conflict in Syria. So there's a little bit of a straw man argument as well, with some of these countries kind of presenting that it's only Russia and China who are stopping them from otherwise doing it, whereas that's just not true. They have no appetite for it, and for good reasons, because they see that it could actually make the hardship on civilians worse and could actually aggravate the situation even further. The first part of your question is I think, in many ways, the more intriguing one, and is one I get asked more and more. I recently gave a speech in Germany, and it was a question from the floor in Germany as well. Why not uniting for peace? There is precedent for this, most notably during the Korean War. And you're right about the votes. So, for example, the last vote, I think, that was held in the General Assembly, which was in August, there was a Syria resolution, and I think it was 143 to like 36, with I think 12 abstentions. Don't quote me exactly on those figures, but I think it was 143, 36, and about 11 or 12 abstentions. So clearly and there's 193 members of the United Nations, of course. So clearly they're mathematically, it's theoretically possible. All I can say is it's certainly something that's been sort of in our advocacy toolbox and in our back pocket, and we have raised it with states from time to time, and my impression is there is absolutely no appetite for a Uniting for Peace resolution. Why? I think it sets precedent. There are a number of other issues going on at the United Nations General Assembly at the moment, and there's one big one which you can probably guess, which they don't want the precedent of a Uniting for Peace resolution, which might open up the door for something else on that other, also Middle Eastern issue. But I think also the main thing is that some state would really have to lead it, and would have to campaign around it, and would have to lobby around it. And at the moment, there seems to be nobody at the UN who really wants to play that role in terms of being a leading advocate for a potential Uniting for Peace resolution. And that's the main reason why we haven't seen it gain any traction. It has been raised by NGOs, but it hasn't been raised in any kind of serious and direct way by a state yet.
Just going to respond to your point regarding the European Union. I think the European Union, in my opinion, very much deserved the prize. In that sense, I think it was an excellent choice and really is one of the greatest contributions that I've seen to peace in that region. I mean, who would have thought, France and Germany would be at peace, after everything that they've been through. So I think already that was a major accomplishment. In terms of cultural diplomacy, I think the European Union is also a perfect platform for new forms of cultural diplomacy. As soon as the cultural diplomacy is multilateral as opposed to unilateral, it's automatic that it becomes less selfish. In the sense if it's let's say Germany's cultural diplomacy activities towards France, of course Germany's agenda will be number one. If it's the European Union's cultural diplomacy, for example, for its European neighbors, etc., suddenly the national agenda is less important and suddenly it's easier to actually do something that can contribute to the greater good. So I think that's an interesting platform also for new forms of cultural diplomacy, multilateral as opposed to unilateral. Second point I wanted to make is, again, in terms of the topic of this panel, what can civil society do? Is it really necessary for civil society to do anything? We have the UN, we have governments. I think civil society can do a lot. One specific example that gives me hope is some of the activities the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy has been doing in the Middle East. Israel-Palestine is one of those issues that many people, even the majority of people I speak to, have given up and think there's no solution for these issues. Governments seem to be at a standstill. In many ways, one sees we're going backwards instead of forwards. We did a number of very interesting things this year, actually, alone, in terms of track 2 diplomacy. One was a meeting we had earlier this year, a private meeting with President Perez, and then also a second meeting with Foreign Minister Lieberman, with a number of our board members, including the former Foreign Minister, Yasser Yakash, former Foreign Minister of Turkey. At a time when Israel and Turkey were not talking, and such a meeting was not possible, we were able to do that, and that led to a number of great initiatives in both directions. Turkey then invited 5 members of the Knesset to Ankara for meetings with Yasser Yakash as well as others, and some very interesting track 2 diplomacy was accomplished. A second example, we partnered with the Paris Center for Peace, as well as Yala, which is an organization that started in Palestine, now has almost 200,000 members around the world, Israelis, Palestinians, Lebanese, Iraqis, the entire region. It's actually the largest peace movement in the region. And ICD actually hosted the first peace summit of that group in Berlin. It would have been impossible for that group to have met in Israel or in Palestine or any of the countries where actually the young leaders were coming from. In Berlin it was possible, and that was something, again, that it really took an NGO. I think a government, it would have been difficult to do that. We weren't allowed to take photos of everyone there. Many of the young leaders who came were at quite high risk, actually, coming to a meeting like that and then returning home. But it succeeded, and they actually have written their peace plan proposal for the Middle East, really the voice of the youth. And I think as we see Arab Spring, etc., we recognize that actually the youth do have a voice. And if one has big numbers, as with the Arab Spring, things can be done. They've received endorsements from Abbas, as well as Perez, as well as Secretary of State Clinton, as well as André Azoulay, the chief advisor to Morocco. So it's making some momentum. Again, this will not revolutionize and bring peace overnight, but I think the point is voices can be heard. And I think civil society does have a role to fulfill. Of course, a different role in different contexts, and one can't take a recipe that works in one place and put it somewhere else. But in that sense, I'd love to hear perhaps other questions or comments also from the audience, if you think there's also a role for civil society. And then the other sort of implied question and the topic for the panel, how should governments work with NGOs? Is it a good thing or a bad thing if a government is funding an NGO? For example, there with Israel and Palestine also, I think as soon as one were to get funding from the Israeli side or the Palestinian side, things change. How is that NGO going to be perceived? Will one be able to bring the same people together? So that's an issue I'd love to throw out there for debate as well. First of all, what potential is there for civil society when dealing with human rights? And secondly, how should they or shouldn't they perhaps work with governments in a complementary way? So I throw that out there for hopefully some reflection and debate.
Comments, questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Nina Ban. I'm from the Ministry of Interior. I recently worked for CARE International, where we were receiving a lot of funding from the US government, and we encountered a lot of problems in the field because of US anti-terrorist legislation. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on how could the NGOs get around that? Because we all know that they need the money to operate, but they're blocked with this.
I jump right in there as a brief response, and then I'll turn it to my colleagues. One has to, especially with cultural diplomacy, be very specific with the strategies for specific countries. If one has a country like Afghanistan, for example, where one had a very strong hard power strategy, let's say for 8 years, it's difficult, I would say, for that same government to then have soft power because you don't really have the legitimacy, you don't have the authenticity because of the hard power before. That doesn't mean they should do nothing, but I think it does mean they need to have different kinds of partners. And that would really be, for me, a great example where civil society, I think, could even do much more than the government. So one has to be careful how one does or does not take funding. I don't want to say don't take the funding from the government. A second example that might be helpful for you is in Morocco. There were some very interesting examples where American cultural diplomacy wasn't actually about presenting American culture in Morocco, but it was about actually presenting and privileging Moroccan culture. There was an organization called I Love Hip Hop in Morocco, and there the U.S. Embassy as well as MTV provided some seed funding. But what they were doing was actually just creating the platform. Before that, it was very difficult for rappers in Morocco to actually perform and produce. And it was actually the U.S. Embassy and MTV, they just created the platform. And it was primarily Moroccan rappers who were actually presenting there. And that's a very interesting vehicle of cultural diplomacy, just to allow voices to be heard that wouldn't normally be heard. A current example in Egypt, actually, we were talking about Ambassador Cynthia Schneider recently, former U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. She had an interesting project also with the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. I forget the exact name now. I think it was Sing, Egyptian Women Sing, it was called. And it was sort of like a Britain's Got Talent or American Idol that she did actually outdoors in Cairo, giving a platform for Egyptian women to perform. And it was very, very well received. So again, it wasn't about telling America's story to the world, but it was a matter of just providing a platform that was very much appreciated in that context. So that's another thing just to think about as we're getting creative, what kinds of cultural diplomacy might allow for dialogue, understanding, and trust to come. Cultural diplomacy more about facilitating access as opposed to necessarily telling one story or another story. So that might be another answer. We can go into depth afterwards in terms of other strategies, but those are some ways in which one can try to get around this problem of actually having a hard power campaign for a certain period of time and then trying to do a soft power campaign.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, since we are talking about cultural diplomacy, in the case of Syria, we know that all roads to diplomacy have failed so far. So how can cultural diplomacy contribute to stabilize the situation in Syria? And another question is about Omar al-Bashir, the president of Sudan. We know that he has been accused and convicted of crimes against humanity, and he's still free, going from one country to another and being welcomed by many countries at the same time. And so I mean, I don't understand the contradiction between, these, is it diplomacy or is it just kind of fact that we have to accept those people just to be part of our lives, like Omar Bashir, just, I don't know, going from one place to another place, being welcomed by many countries, many presidents, and he is a criminal, he's a dictator, living and still free. The other question is about Syria and the investigation of crimes against humanity. We know that in Al-Hula, which is Al-Hula massacre, which is a small village located in the north of Homs, according to the United Nations, 108 people were killed, including 34 women and 49 children. So the victim, according to UN observers here, I quote, were executed in 2 separate incidents. So the thing is that UN observers couldn't arrive in the scene immediately because they were prevented by Syrian forces. So how could they investigate that? And the other question is that since the international media and international correspondents are not allowed to enter the country, there are only some of them, like Al Jazeera, Arabia, and some other like BBC and CNN who enter the country illegally. So how can we gather information? How can we gather evidence of these crimes against humanity? So, what is the alternative? So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of the time and the fact that we're now running over. So if I could ask all the panelists in answering the questions, feel free to answer the question you feel most appropriate, or questions you feel most appropriate to answer, and add any concluding remarks you'd like to do. And Judge, do you have? Sorry, Bashir. Okay. Would you like to comment on that? And then I'll do it again.
Okay. I'm extremely grateful for this additional question on al-Bashir, because it shows some of the shortcomings of the ICC. Of course, there is a trigger mechanism in that the United Nations Security Council can refer a situation to the ICC, as it was done in the situation of Darfur. But shouldn't it be consequent that then also the United Nations contribute to the budget of the ICC so that they can fulfill the mandate given by the United Nations? And furthermore, isn't it binding upon all member states to fully cooperate in such a situation with the ICC? In my personal opinion, yes, because when you have triggered this, then automatically the same body, United Nations, have to fully cooperate and have to arrest. And then, unfortunately, and I have to say, al-Bashir is not yet convicted. He is presumed innocent. Nevertheless, we have a carefully written and even amended indictment against him, and also on genocide after an appeal by the prosecution. But I think coming back to the problem, who becomes prosecutor, who becomes judge at the ICC? I think we have to take care that there is a better quality, with all due respect. And in my personal opinion, the fact that Mr. al-Bashir is not yet arrested is only due to personal problems of the former prosecutor, because he disclosed the fact that there was an arrest warrant in existence. Normally, I've been a prosecutor myself. I would never disclose an arrest warrant, because then, of course, the person would know and would, of course, escape. But for personal reasons, unfortunately, and it was not only the only mistake of the former prosecutor, it was disclosed, and thus, until today's date, he is not yet arrested. And again, we are in the same dilemma. Truth-finding mission versus peace. People always told us, we shouldn't arrest this guy, because he would be one of our partners in our efforts to come to peace. But when we see the reality, what's going on now in Darfur, then we see that we could have avoided a continuation of this disaster, of this serious crime, of this genocide, if Mr. Bashir would have been arrested at that time when the arrest warrant was issued. Thank you.
Thank you very much for adding to the complexity of already complex problem in question. Tony?
Well, in that sense, I'll try and, now the dummy will speak and lower the tone after the learned intervention of our colleague, the judge. I mean, the point made by the judge is a very important one. Bashir has been indicted. There's a warrant for his arrest, but he hasn't actually been convicted of anything. And I appreciate your frustration, and I think many of us feel that frustration of why is this man still free? How is he able to be out at large? And, I certainly look forward to the day when he is behind bars, when he will face justice at The Hague. And soon may that day. It's about making public the arrest warrant. But it has actually put some pressure on him. So, for example, recently, within the last 6 months or so, Malawi had to pull out of hosting an African Union meeting because it's a states party to the ICC, and it said we can't host the AU meeting because if Bashir turns up, we'll have to arrest him and hand him over to the ICC. So this is a humiliation for him in a continent where these things actually count for a lot. It's not enough, but it has curtailed his range of movement. It is a source of embarrassment for him. and it does affect the way that Sudan interacts at the United Nations. And we should also keep in mind the ICC have no police force. They're only ever as strong as the willingness of states parties to actually operate and comply with its arrest warrants. Just very quickly on the issue of hula and evidence. Actually, evidence is not a problem. And I can say this from the point of view of my organization, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. We are overwhelmed with evidence. A day does not go past that we are not getting videos, getting testimony, getting so forth. Videos that will make you not sleep for a couple of weeks. You know, you can see in abundance that are either being smuggled out of Syria one way or another, and are being sent to ourselves and to Human Rights Watch and to other NGOs. So the problem's not evidence. The problem is verifying the evidence, and that's where we actually run into a major issue. And it's why, as I said in my talk, I think something that all states can do, it's a very concrete and easy thing that states can do, is to help fund the commissions of inquiry, help fund human rights observers on the border so they can actually collect relevant testimony and evidence with an eye towards future prosecution.
I didn't express myself on the problem of Syria crisis. There are people who are knowing better than I do about this problem. It's obvious that it is an ethnic civil war. It has not been mentioned religious tensions, sections, sectors have been involved. I have been told recently by someone that Christian group, and there are some Christians in Syria too, like in Lebanon too, they are on the side of government, let's call it this way, because they fear from the radical Muslims on the other side. So what I want to say is situation there is rather complex. For me, there is no doubt that the modus operandi and everything what has been done by Bashar suggests that there is a genocide and crimes against humanity, definitely. When we are speaking about civil society, then we mentioned that it could be individuals and organizations in a manifest interest and will of citizens in a society which are independent of the government and so on. So individuals also part of the civil society. There are persons strong like and stronger than single NGOs. There are persons who are giving a brand to the time they are living in. Let's think of one Martin Luther King, or Dalai Lama, who is still active, still on the scene, praying, moving, going, asking people to solve the problem peacefully, and trying to solve his own country in a peaceful way. Lech Walesa was one who was a remarkable person. Recently, a lady, I believe she is Nobel Prize winner, Aung San Suu Kyi, from Burma, a brave woman fighting for democracy against dictatorship in her country. Nelson Mandela, and we can continue like this. These persons are very important. They are integral and important part of the civil society, and it is important to have there on our side, on the side of the Academy and Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, because these persons have been suggesting peaceful solutions, soft power, not the other one, soft in terms of to persuade through culture as opposed to the hard power. And this is why this is so important. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, before Dr. Adams, I think, offers a few comments to wrap everything up, I wanted to just respond to your question specifically about cultural diplomacy in Syria. On the one hand, my immediate answer would be to say not much. Our cultural diplomacy can't do much. Obviously, it's a very extreme situation where it's very difficult also to work. It's very difficult to really have an impact within Syria. On the other hand, I would say a lot. And I think as we're sitting here today at this conference, I think this is a great example of how one can try to bring together different countries of the world, different powers of the world, to discuss these issues and to try to come up with a solution. I don't have the solution myself, but what we tried to do at the Institute already, actually over the last 2 years, was to have this initiative with genocide prevention and mass atrocities. Luckily, we have the leadership of Prime Minister Janša, who's really been very, very active at a governmental level in the General Assembly of the UN, in the EPP meeting recently in Bucharest, in today's conference as well. The second thing that we're trying to do is to mobilize also civil society, and I'll give you a few announcements about that at the end in terms of what are the next steps after this conference. But in that sort of capacity, I think civil society can do something. Obviously, I'm very respectful of the complexity of these issues, but I think it's clear to us that the military solution really isn't a solution. And if one were to go that route, I think it would just be very, very scary to see how this could all explode in terms of Iran, all of the powers behind. So for me, it's clear, the only option is somehow this track to diplomacy. I don't know what the solution is, but I'm confident that there must be something that can be done then. And if one can really mobilize civil society, governments around the world in a different capacity, perhaps outside of the traditional global governance institutions, there might be a contribution that can be made. So recognizing the chances are small, and it's very, very difficult to really have an impact, especially in such an extreme case. That's how at least this NGO and the civil society organization is trying really to have an impact. So one shouldn't give up in cases like that. I think in the case of Israel and Palestine, it's maybe easier in the sense there you have two groups that are more or less identifiable, and one can try to bring those groups together. In Syria, it's more difficult than that. One really can't talk to the one group in terms of Assad and really what's happening there. So it's, I think, even more complex in Syria. In other conflict situations, I think there's maybe even a greater potential that can be done. So I am convinced something that can be done. I wasn't always convinced. When we first founded the Institute, I really thought if there's a conflict going on, what can we do? But organizations such as Street Football World, which is actually successfully using soccer as a way of bringing people together also in conflicts, whether in Latin America, Africa, etc., in the case of South Africa and in the case of also Rwanda, one can also see how actually cultural diplomacy and sports can also help with reconciliation. So there are easier cases. Syria is, for right now, I think for all of us, the most challenging. But I think that's why we're here. And in the end, I'm hoping that maybe you could answer the question and tell me afterwards what you think really from your perspective can help. And I think that's really the answer has got to come actually from Syrians. And I think ICD stands ready to contribute if there are ways in which you think we can contribute. But in the end, really, we need to, I think, listen more to actually what the Syrians are saying, as opposed to projecting what we think will help. But definitely ICD is committed, and that's why we're here today for this conference. So I am hopeful that contributions can be made. So that's my partial answer to your question. I'm sorry I can't give you a more specific recipe or solution.
Concluding thoughts?
Okay. Mark asked me to provide some sort of a summing up, and it's the end of the day. We've sort of managed to whittle the crowd down to the few and the very committed, and those who obviously have no fear of the cold as well. We've talked a lot about the responsibility to protect, but I think we need to also think about the responsibility to heat when you have people in a room like this for an extended period of time, particularly when some people happen to come from Africa and Australia as well and are not used to these climates. More seriously, on the issue of civil society, I think, as has been discussed, we've seen the remarkable growth of NGOs in a way which none of us expected over the last 2 decades. And it now seems like there's a civil society organization for almost anything. But even if you look at the very big NGOs, civil society organizations, I think that change really took a number of them for granted. And I happen to work just across the road from Human Rights Watch in New York, and I was with Ken Roth, the president there, not too long ago, and we were talking about the development of his organization. And something I didn't realize is that only 20 years ago, Human Rights Watch was an organization of 20 people. It's now hundreds of people with offices all around the world. 20 years ago, it was an organization of 20 people. You look at an organization like International Crisis Group, another one of our founding partners as well. high-level leadership, currently President, Louise Arbour, previous President Gareth Evans, one of the architects of R2P, an organization involved in a very serious way in peace and conflict in the world. And I think, more and more we see that governments are actually outsourcing a lot of the research and a lot of the monitoring. And again, I hate to raise Ken again, but, there was one day last year where I was looking at BBC on my iPhone, and at the top of it, they have the top 8 news stories in the world. And 4 of them had a Human Rights Watch quote in them or were reacting to a Human Rights Watch report. And I sent him a text message going, have you taken over the media? Like, this is extraordinary. But I think it shows the extent to which governments are more and more having to respond to the questions that civil society raise about the sort of world in which we live. Very important questions about the role of human beings in it, how we fit in it, and governments' responsibilities. The days where governments could just hopefully pretend that they didn't have responsibilities or bury something in the back garden or hope an issue will go away have I think, well and truly passed. And that's, I think, true in some ways of the sort of organization that I work for as well. We have this kind of insider-outsider role. Unlike a number of civil society organizations, we are actually mainly funded by governments. About 85% of our funding comes, but at the same time we remain independent of all governments, and we criticize them. We say we criticize everybody equally, focused on the crimes, of course, rather than allegiances of any kind. But I'm also very conscious that not only is civil society a conduit through which ideas can flow to governments and which advocacy can be done in a very effective way sometimes, and they do listen sometimes, but these are freedoms that are not available to all people. And I think, history shows us that where civil society is weak, the chances of human rights violations and of possible mass atrocity crimes as well is more of a risk. Civil society is one of those, it's a barometer of how a society is doing, more generally around the rule of law and governance and so forth. So I think that's something which we must always keep in our mind as well. In terms of the broader themes that we've discussed today, I think there's been a lot of talk about the strengths and the weaknesses within the UN system and the international order as it's currently configured, and some very legitimate issues raised about things like United Nations Security Council reform and enlargement, something that I think is necessary, around the role of organizations like the Human Rights Council, which has played a very positive role with its commissions of inquiry in Syria and in Libya as well. The need for the United Nations General Assembly to become, in some ways, a stronger and more active organization. And of course, the questions that have been raised in terms of accountability, international tribunals, the ICC and so forth, and progress that we still need to make. But I'm not one of those people. I accept all of those criticisms, and I make many of them myself on a day-to-day basis. But I'm not one of these people that thinks that because of those failings, because of those weaknesses, that we should somehow go around the UN or reject the UN or drop the UN. I'm often reminded of the way that the UN is sometimes treated by states who don't get their way, rightly or wrongly. It's sort of like yelling at the stadium when your team fails. When your team loses a game, you don't yell at the stadium. You look at what's happening in terms of the United Nations and the way that the body interacts with one another. The UN is only ever as strong as the political will of its members. And we obviously need to do much, much more. Another theme was, the whole issue of what next for Slovenia or for the Czech Republic or for any other country with regards to the responsibility to protect. I think, one of the things we're really emphasizing is precisely this question of appointing R2P focal points in government, but that's not the end of it. It should really be the beginning of a process of, as I think one of the Slovenian academics said before, of looking internally and externally. What is our history? What does this mean for us as a people? And what does the broader history of mass atrocity crimes mean? Are there emerging threats in our society? Not all people happen to live in societies where these are not a remote possibility. This was something that was brought home to me in a very direct way, where we have an R2P governmental focal point appointed in an African country. That's all I'll say. I won't say the country. In an African country, who came to me and said, I'm very happy to be the R2P focal point, but here's my question for you. What if I happen to think that my government is the most possible potential perpetrator in the part of the world in which I live. How am I supposed to carry out my role as a focal point? Very important question, a very challenging question. So I think it's an internal process of countries looking at their own history, looking at their memory, looking at where they've come from, and an external question of looking at how they can be greater regional collaboration, bilateral collaboration, collaboration through a network as well. And in terms of what Slovenia can do also, I think, don't stop being a leader. It's just so immensely significant that your Prime Minister has put this up near the top of his political agenda. So finally, I'll just sum up by saying the following. I think the role of civil society, to come back to the theme of this particular session, is to act as a guarantor on the promises that states make. NGOs, civil society should be the conscience of their societies. And together they should be, we are, not they, we, because we're talking about the people in this room. Together, members of civil society are the conscience of the world. And no one else is going to do this for us. We can't, as much as I work all on a day-to-day basis with governments, we can't just rely on governments to do it for us. Civil society is the first line of defense in the protection and prevention of people from mass atrocity crimes. And finally, I just want to say on a very personal level, to thank, of course, Mark and the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, sorry, I'm getting my D words mixed up there, for organizing this and for hosting us all here today and having this happen. Of course, to the Prime Minister Janša and the Slovenian government for being so incredibly strong and vocal and important to this ongoing debate. I think we also, if they're still up there, the translators who have had to work tirelessly all day, a number of us for whom English is our first language speak very quickly and speak with strange accents in my case. So I think, acknowledgement for the translators. And most of all, yes, indeed. And most of all, for you, for the audience, it would have been a very boring day for us if we were just sitting talking amongst ourselves. But thank you all for coming and participating, and I'll hand back to the marks.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Adams. I'd like to, you took a few of the thank yous away from me, actually.
Sorry.
So, in that case, looks like the microphone, here we go, we'll take this one. So in that case, here we go. All right, so first of all, I had actually three things that I wanted to do. Actually, first of all, discuss a little bit the next steps, what's going to happen after this conference. Secondly, a group of thank yous, some of which you took from me. And then thirdly, the group photo at the end. But before I talk about the next steps, I'd like to specifically thank this panel, so actually Mark Vlasic and the panelists. So I'd ask for your please help in expressing our sincere gratitude, first of all, to all of these panelists for this panel, if possible.